So I'm Justin Gest. I'm an assistant professor of public policy at George Mason University at the Schar School of Policy and Government. My research looks at immigration and also minority politics. I recently authored my second book, which is about white working class politics here in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom.
How did the white working class people drift to the ends of the political spectrum?
Yeah, I think much of this coincides with the decline in the manufacturing economy in the United States. Many white working class people, for a very long period of time, could depend on stable jobs, good incomes from jobs that really did not require higher education or any major forms of qualification. So there are very few hurdles in order to actually get access to the American middle class. And with the deterioration of the manufacturing sector, the emergence of the service and high technology economies also came a greater contingency of work and labor in the United States. You add all those things together, and the white working class people who once formed the backbone of the United States and many European societies have become economically poorer, politically weaker, and socially more peripheralized to the edges of their society. And those sort of triple transformations in their world has led to an enormous sense of marginality. I'm not sure that it's necessarily there's that strong of a process between being on the margins on the one hand and radicalizing. I think that it is precisely often those who are on the margins, whether socially or economically or politically, who are at risk of radicalization. And in many cases, it's just a matter of whether there's an opportunity to radicalize, whether there's a cause, and whether there's a leader who's going to harvest that kind of discontent. And the truth is that that kind of political capital was there for the picking, but it took someone like Donald Trump, who actually was able and sought after them, in order to harvest it. So he became the voice of those who felt marginalized. He became the voice of frustration and the vote for people who sought to protest the reality that they were facing.
A great role in this process is played by this sense of loss, social loss, disorientation, economic loss, lost wealth, as you just mentioned, and then the political loss, loss of power. So I'm just wondering, that leads to a certain sort of, sense of nostalgia.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. You know, Donald Trump, in the simplicity of his slogan of making America great again, taps into a pervasive sense of nostalgia and that sense of loss. For many white working class people, they look to the past and only really see an uncomplicated view of prosperity and status and good social standing and power. Even if wrong and overly simplified, that is what they think. And the only way they can imagine a post-traumatic future is to reestablish the pre-traumatic past. And so that's precisely what many people actually wish to do, is to turn the clock backward into that uncomplicated past, that vision of what it used to be like. All of these politics has undertones about race relations, and it's not often all that deep under the surface. It comes to the surface regularly. The truth is that when you have a slogan like "Make America Great Again," very few people of color in the United States look to the past and think that it was better than the present or what the future holds. The past in the United States, I mentioned it was uncomplicated, the white working class people's views of the past. The things that it was glossing over was a history of oppression, legacies of structural disadvantage, and really unfair society that did not put people on a level playing field. And it's harder for white working class people to see that and to discern a sense of white privilege and wages that are invisible wages of whiteness that they're privy to. And that's simply because that's the only world that they know. But for people of color who vividly recall those histories of oppression and can talk to family members and friends about the residue of that history, it's very vivid, and the past does not look quite so rosy. It does not look so great.
So, do you think in this process the media has played a role?
Yes, definitely. I don't think any of the major media organizations in the United States are especially advocating for the alt-right and its agenda. What the media does is it promotes their views by simply giving them airtime, by giving them notice, recognition, broadcast, and headlines. And that's simply because they have a voracious appetite for not only content, but controversy, because controversy sells. And what the alt-right is saying is inherently controversial because it is often quite prejudiced, it's quite nativist, it's quite offensive. And and they have these loose affiliations with white nationalist groups and supremacist groups that are very ugly and also controversial. And so, it makes for very interesting headlines and clickbait on the internet, and good ratings on television and radio. And so, but inadvertently, what these media organizations do when they cover these stories is they also raise to prominence the fact that these groups exist, and in some ways, many would argue, they legitimize it.
You went out to Youngstown, Ohio. Like, I mean, you met all these people. I mean, you had the concerns. You wrote about them. So I'm just wondering, like, for you personally, what struck you most just by having that experience? And then, as a second sort of like and final question is like going forward, like, what do you think needs to be done to in order to be able to address the concerns of these people out there?
Yeah, I think two things strike you when you spend a lot of time in white working class communities. The first is a visceral pain that is felt amongst them, and the sense of being vilified and outcasted and suddenly not belonging in societies that they once defined. And whether or not you agree with them, you have to, in some ways, lament and empathize with them, and feel that sense of sympathy for those views. Again, whether or not you actually agree with why they feel that way. But the other thing is that I walked out of a lot of people's living rooms, and I thought to myself, after interviewing them and their families, I thought to myself, gosh, these people's children never had a chance. There is disadvantage and disempowerment in the United States, a developed country, a very wealthy country, a very powerful country. There are people who grow up and will never have an opportunity to reach the ladders that actually spread that wealth, that spread that power around, that allow them to participate holistically into the democracy and claims-making process, simply because they weren't actually given the educational opportunities to do so or the opportunities to engage in their societies because of the barriers that we put up. And that sense of entrenchment is what is so, I think, disturbing for those of us who study the disadvantaged. Whether they are black or white or brown, it doesn't matter. That disadvantage is structural, and those structures are race blind. In terms of what needs to happen, I think that, particularly the Democratic Party can do a lot more to transcend those racial boundaries, to recognize that there are no black problems or white problems or brown problems. They're simply problems. And again, those problems do not discriminate according to color. They are debt. They are a lack of education. They are environmental disasters. And those kinds of phenomena that really weaken societies. Poor health is another one. lack of access to healthcare. Bad health, debt, disaster doesn't care if you're white working class or black working class. And the truth is that parties don't do a very good job of championing these causes to help those who are disadvantaged. And they don't do a particularly good job of promoting the symbolism behind this by actually promoting people who are of working class backgrounds to prominence. And so working class people are left to felt more and more external from the very important political processes that are determining our future.